You might have noticed that China's demographics have become sort of a hot topic recently, and there is a good reason for it. In 2022, China saw its population decrease for the first time after 60 years of rapid growth. India now overtook it as the most populous country, and China is now battling a deadly combo of a quickly aging population, fewer young people, and extremely low fertility rates that keep going down every year. And the widely accepted story is that China's demographics are only gonna get worse, as the country is headed for a demographic disaster that will hugely damage both its economy and global ambitions. But despite those headlines, the story that we came to accept as a fact might not actually be true. And there's strong evidence that China's demographic collapse is not actually happening anytime soon. But how can that be possible, given all the issues that we just named? What's China's secret demographic advantage that will help it weather this storm? And if the story about China's demographic collapse is not true, what are the consequences for China and for the world? But before we get to that, we need to start by first explaining what are actually China's demographic problems, because there are essentially three big issues that China is dealing with. The first of the primary concerns is that China is aging, and although every developed country is experiencing that as well, in China this is happening at an alarmingly fast rate. And it's happening while China is still a middle-income country. Unlike Japan or Germany, which experienced aging populations after reaching high levels of economic development, China is encountering this demographic shift at a much lower GDP per capita. And the country might become old before rich, facing the challenges of an aging society without the financial means to support it. At the same time, the population is shrinking as well. Despite government efforts to encourage families to have more children, China's population dropped by almost 2 million people in 2023, and projections show that China's population could decline by almost 50% by the end of the century, potentially shrinking to just over 700 million people. A shrinking population means a smaller labor force, which could slow economic growth and lead to labor shortages, especially in critical sectors. Plus, an increasing elderly population will strain social services and healthcare systems, creating a higher dependency ratio where less workers are available to support a growing number of retirees. And all of that is made significantly worse by the third major issue, that China has one of the lowest fertility rates in the world, after Singapore and South Korea. In 2022, its fertility rate plummeted to just 1.09 births per woman, far below the replacement level of 2.1 needed to maintain a stable population. A lot of those issues are slow burn consequences of China's one-child policy, which was in place from 1980 to 2015, implemented out of fear that China's population at the time was growing too fast for the economy to handle. But while the one-child policy did slow the population growth down, a generation later it also created a number of long-term demographic challenges. Even after the government relaxed the policy in 2015, the birth rate remained stubbornly low. Decades of social conditioning towards smaller families have made many families hesitant to have more than one child. And other aspects of living in modern China are adding to this effect, as more people live in cities than ever before, where they work long hours and experience rising costs of living, which all makes raising a larger family increasingly difficult. And all of those demographic challenges are expected to increasingly affect China's economy, as the aging population, coupled with a declining workforce, could lead, according to some, to a doom loop, where economic productivity declines, innovation stalls, and the burden on the working population becomes unsustainable. Now, you might be kinda confused at this point, because all of that does sound really bad. So why would the story of China's demographic collapse be exaggerated? Well, these predictions leave out some pretty important facts, and mainly that China has one major advantage to help it avert this coming crisis. Because even though China's demographics, and especially the aging of its society, are a problem that will eventually get worse, for several reasons this might happen much later than is generally thought. And there's a strong chance that the demographics will get better rather than worse in the short and mid-term, and that they won't have the huge negative impact on China's economy that everyone expects until at least the 2050s, which was first pointed out by Noah Smith on his Substack. And by the way, if you want to hear more stories that help you better understand what's happening in the world, you might want to go sign up to my upcoming newsletter, bringing you geopolitical news and analysis from around the globe. It's completely free, and you can find the sign up link in the description, so check it out. And now back to the explanation. The key reason why the demographic effect might not be nearly as devastating as we tend to expect is because China has one major advantage up its sleeve: a large young generation that's currently waiting in the demographic pipeline, and that could represent a lifeline for its demographic issues for the next 20 or so years. This is China's population pyramid, showing the age structure of the population. You have the large Chinese Gen Xers in their 50s, an even larger segment of millennials in their 30s and 40s, and the much smaller Gen Z population of people in their 20s. Because the Chinese Gen Z generation is so much smaller than the previous ones, the demographics now look a lot worse. From the ratio of retirees versus the people in productive age to the number of births, as there are fewer people entering the workforce and fewer people starting families. But the next generation, the so-called alphas, or people who are now between 5 and 15 years old, and who will be entering the workforce in the 2030s, is actually a lot bigger than the current Gen Z. This is a result of a ripple effect from 3 generations ago. In the 1950s and 60s, China was experiencing years of social and economic unrest, as well as a nationwide famine. But after the situation stabilized, it saw a huge spike of births as people were starting families that they previously postponed, which led to the abnormally massive China's baby boomer generation. And the alphas are a demographic echo of the large millennial generation, which was itself an echo of the baby boomers. But what this means is that in the 2030s and 2040s, China's demographic situation shouldn't be getting worse, but rather it should actually get a lot better. As the alphas enter the workforce, they will help stabilize the demographics, and China's working age population is projected to actually increase in the coming years. The ratio of people in productive age to pensioners in China today is actually still a lot better than in Germany, and even in the 2030s and 2040s, China will still be in a better situation than Japan is today. Now, that said, the Chinese alpha generation will not be large enough to completely stop or reverse the aging of the population, and this will remain a challenge for China, just like it is for many developed countries. And while Western countries typically counter this trend with immigration, and even countries like Japan or South Korea are increasingly adopting this strategy and opening up to immigration as well, China clearly doesn't want to go down this route. However, China does have a different option of how to mitigate the aging of the society, because up until recently, it had one of the lowest retirement ages in the world, with women retiring as early as 50 and men at 60 years old. Recently, China announced that this is now changing, and it will significantly raise the retirement age, which will significantly delay the shrinking of its workforce and give China breathing room to adapt for the future. So, what does all of that mean? What changes if China's demographic crisis is not nearly as imminent or as catastrophic as we thought? Well, China still has a problem, but it won't really start biting until the 2050s, and so it has 2 more decades to prepare for that. Its demographic structure will provide a buffer to adapt and implement policies to mitigate it. Although, whether the government will do that or not, and how much you can actually do, is another issue. The bigger takeaway, however, is that the story of China's decline, which is very popular at the moment, might be kind of overblown. China does have a range of very serious economic issues, including some deeply ingrained structural problems, and it is unlikely to keep growing at the same pace as it once did. But it's also unlikely that its economic strength would just disappear in the years and decades to come, at least not because of a demographic collapse. The demographics will represent a challenge, but it will be a manageable one, and it might slow the economy down, but so will similar issues slow down other economies from Europe to Asia. From a US perspective, it means that the idea of a Chinese collapse might be more of a wishful thinking than a reality, and that China, as the US chief rival, is not going anywhere.